Chapter 11:34. Peaceful morning. Nothing else happened on their way back to the siege capital. It had grown harder to eavesdrop on Morgan and Maddock once again, so Sonny didn't learn much about the consequences of Beastmaster's mocking message. He did, however, understand from small hints and clues that Valor's own ambush had gone slightly better than the one prepared by Song. Most of the ambushers even survived, and were now following a different route to return to safe territory. The great clans had basically exchanged slaps. What would come next were actual blows. It was nice to return back to civilization. Sonny slept in a soft bed, had a hot shower, and prepared himself an actual meal. Despite the dire war raging somewhere on the continent, two wars, even his routine was strangely mundane and peaceful. He even received a video message from Rain. The network in East Antarctica was not nearly as in shambles as it had been in the Antarctic Center, so the bandwidth allocated to him allowed for such frivolities from time to time. To Sonny's slight disappointment, Rain only spoke about what was happening in her life for a short while, using the rest of the recording to demonstrate the progress she was making in her training and ask for pointers. The message ended with a few carefree sentences. "Oh, by the way, do you remember the classmate I told you about? The one whose sister is an MWP pilot in Antarctica. Apparently, her unit got into a really bad situation, and she only survived because a master named Devil saved her. Thank the gods. I can't even imagine how her family would have felt if not for him. Anyway, if you know that guy, buy him a drink. Better yet, try to stay close to him. He is apparently some sort of a big hero, so you'll be safer with him. What I am trying to say is that you should be careful. Take care of yourself. Bye." The message ended, leaving Sonny in amused silence. He shook his head. What are the chances? And what the hell does she mean, do I know that guy? Have I not told her that people call me the Devil of Antarctica? I'm sure I bragged about it. Then he went about composing a response, first going over her technique and swordsmanship, then adding a few phrases at the end. "Yes, I do remember. As for the devil, as it happens, I know him pretty well. That guy is indeed amazing. He is also very powerful, handsome, and disgustingly rich. Your classmate's sister was really very fortunate to meet him. He mostly keeps company with saints and beautiful legacies from the great clans these days. But since you asked, I'll go buy him a drink right after finishing writing this message." Sonny grinned as he finished and sent the message, then fulfilled his promise by walking to the nearest provision stall and ordering a cup of cheap synthetic coffee. He savored its warmth on the street, watching the refugees sheltered within the city walls go about their daily lives. The atmosphere in the siege capital was not at all light. In fact, it was charged by distress and dread, but it was not at all as heavy as it had been in Falcon Scott. No matter how full of tribulations and anxiety their lives had become, people actually lived here, not just tried desperately to survive. Sonny felt that he was alive, too. Rain was safe and not showing any symptoms of the spell. The evacuation was proceeding at a healthy pace. Nephi's, Cassie, Effie, Kai, and Jet were all doing fine. As for the great clans, he now had a clear target in mind, at least. The assassins of the Song clan were going to arrive soon. Preventing the clash between them and the forces of Valor from spilling into these streets would be his first independent move. He had to prepare well. Sonny finished his coffee, then took a walk toward the headquarters of the Valor clan. His duties as a government envoy could not wait. There were issues he had to pass along, reports he had to make, and secrets he had to steal. Before he could do any of it, though, Cassie stopped by the small office Sonny had been given within the compound to fetch him on behalf of Morgan. The Princess of War wanted to see him first thing in the morning, for some reason. As they walked through the corridors of the lavish compound, Sonny glanced at the blind girl and asked, "What exactly does she want this time?" Cassie hesitated for a few moments, then shrugged. "I'm not sure. She seemed excited about something, well, as far as Morgan allows herself to show genuine emotions at least. Sonny sighed. After a short span of silence, he asked another question. Hey, can you help me out with something in the near future? The blind girl slowed down a little. With what? He considered his words for a few moments. I want to visit a few places on the Chained Isles. The flying ship Noctis left behind can now descend through the crushing, right? It will only take a couple days if you pilot it. Cassie smiled. Oh, sure, I can help. The ivory tower has drifted east of the tier, though, so the journey might take a bit more time. Sonny had a few reasons to return to the Chained Isles, but the main one was on the shipwreck island, where he had fought the Wormven. Or rather, under it. The remains of Sun Prince still swayed there, tangled in the broken chains. Sonny wanted the imp to devour as much of the steel giant as possible. His initial desire to make the little fiend develop a nearly indestructible body was a lofty one, but in practice, finding enough magical metal to feed the ravenous shadow was proving to be a problem. So it was very convenient to know the location of a giant, dead, ancient iron saint. As he was imagining how much the imp would improve after sinking his teeth into the Sun Prince, Cassie led him to a guarded door and opened it. Sonny was a little surprised, since it was not one of the usual places where he met the emissaries of valor. In fact, it was a spacious, heavily reinforced dojo with all kinds of swords and implements of war resting in armored cases. Morgan was standing in the middle of the dojo, wearing nothing except for a light black tunic. Her vermilion eyes were gleaming with sharp, intense desire. Desire to cross swords with a worthy opponent and destroy them. Sonny froze. I suddenly don't feel safe. The Princess of Clan Valor smiled widely at the sight of him. Master Sunless, if I remember correctly, you promised me a spar. Sonny remembered his first clash with Morgan very well. Back then, he had been a mere awakened. Nevertheless, as far as awakened went, he had considered himself to be somewhat of an outlier in terms of personal power and combat skill. He had even entertained the idea of winning their duel. Sonny had been blessed with the powers of a divine aspect, trained by Changing Star of the immortal Flame Clan, and tempered in the ruthless crucible of the Forgotten Shore, and possessed of an aspect legacy. So there had been a reason for his confidence. The streak of easy wins he had achieved in the dreamscape also played a role. Even though some of the opponents he had faced were challenging foes, none managed to make him feel seriously threatened. Sonny had involuntarily grown a little arrogant. Morgan had destroyed that arrogance. She had been the first master he crossed swords with, and not just any master at that. The heiress of the great clan Valor was at the absolute pinnacle of what an ascended could be. Being utterly crushed by her in less than 40 seconds had hit him like a bucket of cold water, instantly extinguishing whatever nascent hubris Sonny could have developed. Her oppressively flawless skill, her overwhelming physical prowess, her crystal-clear killing intent, all of it made a lasting impression on him. Sonny had returned with two valuable gifts from that battle. The first was a breakthrough in his mastery of shadow dance. The second was a stark reminder of how many crouching tigers there were among the awakened. Yes, he was outstanding and powerful, but he was not the only outstanding, powerful person out there. Ever since that battle, Sonny had been instinctively comparing every master he fought with Morgan. So far, no one had made the cut, not in the waking world, not in the dream realm, and not in the second nightmare. Which was why he was very curious to see how he would compare to her now that they were both ascended. Sonny was not the same person who had met Morgan in the dreamscape. He had lived through too many tribulations since then. The Night Temple, the Red Colosseum, the Gauntlet of Nightmares, the Temple of the Chalice, the Ivory City, and the Antarctic Center. From the quiet dread of Low 49 to the cold despair of Falcon Scott. Each of these trials had left scars on his soul, but also made him a much more experienced and deadly fighter. That is true, but Morgan must not have remained stagnant either. St. Tyrus had once said the Anvil's daughter was too young and inexperienced to challenge the third nightmare, which had to mean that she had been actively earning the necessary experience all that time. So this spar of theirs was bound to be interesting. Sure, I was looking forward to it. She nodded with satisfaction, then gestured for Cassie to take a seat. Then, Morgan walked to a case containing a multitude of training swords, all fashioned to withstand the intense pressure of being wielded by masters, and thus insanely expensive, and looked at them thoughtfully. What weapon would you prefer to use? Swords, spears, something more exotic. Not weapons at all, perhaps. Oh, I forgot to ask. Are you going to be fighting as is, or assume that pseudo-transformation of yours? It did not seem like she particularly cared, as if it was of no concern whether she would face a human or a towering fiend. Sonny hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. No transformation. It only serves as a force multiplier if the underlying skill is not there. Using it is pointless, not to mention a drain on the essence. I mostly activate it when there are too many enemies around to reap the benefit of having 4 arms. As for the weapon, he pulled on a shadow cast by a support pillar and formed it into a blunt, featureless black takai. That would be enough. Morgan smiled. Neat trick. With that, she took a simple straight training sword from the case and walked to the center of the dojo. Stopping there, she pierced Sonny with a sharp look of her vibrant vermilion eyes. I would have suggested using our aspect abilities freely, but that would probably destroy a large part of this level of the compound. So, sadly, we will have to limit ourselves to our dormant and awakened powers. I hope you don't mind. Sonny shrugged. He did not mind. It would have been a shame if he had not learned what Morgan's ascended ability was already. But he had, in fact. He not only observed her for more than a month and came up with a solid theory, but had also asked Cassie for confirmation. The blind girl was now able to see both the attributes and the aspect abilities of those near her, after all. She was a priceless source of information, an almost limitless well of it, really. Thanks to her, Sonny now knew a lot about many people, including the likes of Whispering Blade and Beastmaster. With Cassie's help, Sonny had finally confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that those of the Valor bloodline, Anvil and his children, at least, carried the lineage of War God in their veins. As for Morgan's aspect abilities, her dormant ability allowed her to passively enhance the sharpness of anything she touched. Her awakened ability was a comprehensive physical augmentation with an emphasis on resilience. Basically, her body could become as durable as tempered steel. Her ascended ability was a strange one, though. It allowed her to assimilate enchantments into her body and soul, inheriting their effects. As a master, the number of enchantments she could absorb was limited to 3, and they could be switched freely for different ones at any point in time. Considering how powerful, versatile, and unpredictable such an ability was, Sonny was more than willing to forgo using ascended abilities today. Standing opposite of each other, the two of them studied the opponent for a while in silence. Sonny was remembering the 36 seconds he had managed to hold out against Morgan the last time they fought. Morgan was probably studying his posture and expression, as well as replaying the scenes from the battle against the Titanic horde in her mind. After all, she didn't know that this was not the first time the two of them faced each other holding swords in their hands. Slowly, a smile of anticipation appeared on Morgan's beautiful face. Her vermilion eyes glinted and her crimson lips parted, revealing pearly white teeth. Prepare yourself, Master Sunless. Sonny almost rolled his eyes. Is there really a need to announce her ata? He did not get to finish that thought, however. Suddenly, Morgan was beside him, and her sword was falling down like the inescapable blade of a guillotine. Morgan moved fast, much faster than she had moved in the dreamscape. One moment she was standing calmly a dozen meters away from him. The next she was already there, delivering a downward cut aimed precisely at his temple. Luckily, Sunny was prepared for her. He sidesteps, raising his shadow takai to intercept the training sword. The two blades met and bit into each other, connected in a bind. He felt the shock of the impact travel through his bones and pushed the sword away, at the same moment as Morgan raised her hands, changing the angle of her weapon and pushing it forward over the takai. The tip of the training sword barely missed his eye. But now, momentum was on Sunny's side. He took a step forward, past their two blades, and rammed her with his shoulder. Morgan was thrown back, and a split second later, it was her turn to deflect a cut, only the cut had never come. Instead of trying to twirl his takai into a downward cut that was not too different from the one his opponent had delivered a moment ago, Sunny simply kept its position, raised above his shoulder, the blade facing back, and struck her in the face with the pommel. No matter how fast Morgan was, no matter how strong, the distance between them was too short, and that strike was too swift. Better yet, the blade of the takai remained between his neck and the enemy's sword. Sunny saw no way for her to escape. And she didn't. Instead of awkwardly trying to avoid the strike, Morgan simply lowered her head and received it with the ridge of her brow, where the bone was strongest. She didn't seem fazed by the powerful blow, either. In fact, Sunny felt as if he had struck steel. He almost heard a metallic ring. The two of them pushed away from each other, ending that first, probing exchange. Sunny was pleased with himself. Morgan seemed pleased, too. A wide smile bloomed on her face. She briefly touched her forehead, then glanced at her fingers, where a drop of blood was smeared across her alabaster skin. The smile turned into a grin. Wonderful, simply wonderful. Nephis, Cassie, and you. I've been starved of good opponents for so long, and now there are three. And you are all so different as well. She looked like a starving glutton who suddenly found himself choosing between three exquisite dishes. Sunny raised an eyebrow and glanced at the blind girl, who sat quietly by the wall of the dojo. What, that battle maniac got Cassie involved in her training regime, too. Noticing his gaze, Morgan chuckled. Kasha might not be the strongest master out there, but in terms of pure technique, she is among the best. And with how potent her precognition is, fighting her made me exercise skills and muscles that I had never had to exercise before, which is a rare boon for me. Why, have the two of you never fought? Sunny lingered for a moment, then shook his head. No, not with swords at least. Morgan gave him a curious look. Ah, it's your loss. She raised her sword and prepared to launch another strike. Her smile turned from charming to dangerous. I won't hold back then. With that, Morgan attacked, turning into a furious whirlwind of steel. Curses! Sunny had been pleased with his performance in their first exchange, but his satisfaction quickly evaporated. Now that Morgan was done testing him, the onslaught of attacks she unleashed was simply unreasonable. In terms of raw physical strength and speed, the two of them were about equal, granted. Sunny was only using 3 of his shadows to augment himself. He would have had an advantage if he used all 5. But then again, his enemy was probably holding something back too. In terms of technique, combat intelligence, and experience, to his deep dissatisfaction, Sunny realized that he was still inferior to the Princess of War in that regard. He had already known that Morgan's skill was near flawless, honed into a perfect tool by decades of practice and chilling killing intent. She was the epitome of what a legacy was supposed to be, a person born and raised for the sole purpose of being a fighter. The people who forged her into a deadly weapon were some of the best warriors humanity had to offer, as well. Subjected to Morgan's inescapable sword, he felt suffocated. Back in the dreamscape, he had been simply crushed. He had felt as if his enemy was not a person, but a hurricane. The 36 seconds he had lasted against her seemed like a miracle. Today, the situation was different. Sonny was at a disadvantage, but he could confidently defend himself. He was older, stronger, and more experienced. His mastery of shadow dance had improved a lot, too. That said, the problem was, what the hell, she is insane. Although Morgan's battle style was too sophisticated and strangely elusive to be absorbed by him in a short amount of time, he did manage to glean a few things about it, enough to be able to predict the general flow of her movements. However, that flow was flawless, entirely devoid of any vulnerability he could exploit. What was the point of knowing her moves in advance if he couldn't do anything about it? She fought in a way that left him with no choices. It was as though there was a steel cage around him, and its sharp bars were slowly constricting. Soon enough, he would be caught and cut into pieces by them. Sonny knew that if the enemy had no vulnerabilities, the best way to defeat them was to create some. So, he tried to lure Morgan into several insidious traps, to no avail. She seemed to see straight through them, solving the puzzles he presented in an instant. Even all this time later, she was still like an insurmountable obstacle for him. The savage, but simultaneously chillingly calculating deadliness of her perfectly lethal skill was like a work of art. Its theme was war, violence, and destruction, and Sonny was both the subject and the sole member of the audience for whom that art was being created, as well as its victim. At that moment, he realized something. Sonny realized that this was the worst possible way for him to fight someone like Morgan. Direct confrontation, contests of strength and skill, all of that was not his battlefield. The most dire battles Sonny had fought, he won with cunning and guile. He employed underhanded tricks, used every single resource available to him in unexpected ways, and tore victories from the claws of fate through sheer force of will and boundless spitefulness. He was good in a fight, of course, much better than most. But while being a sharp sword was an important conduit of his will, it was not what made him truly deadly. What a fine realization. The question was, how could he turn this duel around and push it toward a direction where he held the advantage? There were ways to overcome Morgan's furious, cold, suffocating might, surely. A more important question, though, was if he even wanted to. Up until now, both Sonny and Morgan had acted relatively tame. It might not have looked like it from the side, considering how fierce and vicious a battle of two ascended inevitably appeared. Masters possessed superhuman speed, strength, and resilience. A clash between them would look like a collision of two natural forces to a mundane person, and a mundane building would be swiftly destroyed should it become an arena for it. Which was why the dojo they were fighting in was lined with durable armored plates, and the training sword Morgan was using cost a fortune. Nevertheless, they were holding back, not even considering the fact that the two of them had agreed to forego using their ascended abilities. Sonny had yet to make use of Shadow Step. Morgan had not made her weapon sharper either, preferring to rely on pure technique. It was as though both of them had silently decided to make this spar a contest of skill for now, which was actually a disadvantage for Sonny. The fewer resources he had at his disposal, the more restrained he felt. Morgan, on the other hand, seemed to only ever need one resource, her sword. In fact, even that was not necessary. Her body itself was the sword, capable of cutting through tempered steel without hindrance. So if Sonny wanted to turn things around, he needed the situation to change, pushing their duel into the next stage. However, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. What is my goal here? He had been curious to compare his strength with Morgan's. He had been given little choice but to accept her request as well. He naturally wanted to win. But was a victory really in his best interest? Now that Sonny was being closely observed by the great clans, There was no possibility of not drawing their attention, which was why he had decided to accept that fact and settle for creating a very specific impression of himself instead of trying to remain unseen. Sunny wanted both Valor and Song to think of him as someone strong, exceptional even, but not too exceptional and not too strong. They had to think of him as a powerful but crude upstart, a talented outskirt rat that had achieved a lot and had the potential to achieve even more but not much more. As someone who could be predicted and controlled. Considering all that, did he really want to defeat Morgan? Could he even defeat her? Well, of course I can. Saint, Nightmare, Imp, and Serpent were also part of his power. Morgan possessed a great number of mighty echoes, but those had come from outside of her aspect. The shadows, on the contrary, had come from within Sunny's, which meant that he would obliterate her in a contest of unadulterated personal power, which did not matter, really, since such contests never happened in real life. There were always other components involved. The transcendent echoes might have been external to Morgan's own power, but they would rip Sunny apart just as well. No, I don't really want to best Morgan today. What I really need to do is lose in a way that will make it easier for me to gain access to her secrets. So, lose in a way that would leave her wanting for more. Being a personal sparring partner of the heir of the great clan Valor was a dangerous position to be in, not the least because Morgan could potentially learn much more about Sunny than he would have liked her to. But it was also the best position to be in for a spy. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Sunny frowned for a moment. Isn't this the same reasoning Nephi's used to justify her decision to join Valor? Maybe it was, but he did not really care. Many things had changed since then, including Sunny himself and the situation he was in. All right then, let's do this. He deflected another of Morgan's blows, evaded her follow-up strike. 3 of them, actually, all chained into one predatory, fluid motion, and raised an eyebrow. Should we take it up a notch? She took a step forward, sent her sword flying toward his throat with diabolical speed, and smiled pleasantly. Let's. Sunny sidestepped her strike and nodded. Then his technique instantly changed. Before, he was using a fluid mix of various simple styles he had picked up over the years. Such a patchwork technique did not excel in any one thing in particular, but was flexible and hard to predict. Sunny had held to his best cards, though, unwilling to share them with the enemy, a potential enemy at least. Broken sword style that Nephi's had taught him, Saint's grounded technique that had originated from the legions of Nether, the battle art of Solvin's zealots, which had come from the war maidens of the Red Sect. Those he had hidden within himself. Now that he wanted to lose in the most interesting fashion, though. What would really intrigue a battle maniac like Morgan? She had faced and defeated all kinds of awakened, and had learned all manner of battle styles, no doubt. Her collection was probably even larger than Sunny's own. So what technique could he show that was both exceptional and fascinating, and most importantly, unknown to Morgan? One particular style came to mind. It was one that he had learned by chance, not from awakened, ascended, or even saints, but from nightmare creatures. The primeval hunters that had emerged from the gate near Rain's school, wielding weapons made of flint. After all, if anything could capture the attention of an obsessed connoisseur of swordsmanship, and all things related to combat like Morgan, it was a technique that might have had just lain at the root of all techniques, all styles. Sunny's movements changed, shifting from fluid and refined to uncomplicated and brutal. His whole demeanor changed, too. The savage technique of the Barrow Wraiths was straightforward and rudimentary, but there was a primal lethality to its clear, callous barbarity. It was the expression of a pure, unclouded intent to kill, simple, but in no way crude. There was nothing about it to dilute the ruthless resolve of a hunter who sought to slaughter his prey in the most direct, efficient way possible. Sunny remembered the desperate fight in front of the nightmare gate and attacked, cruelly aiming to slice through Morgan's hamstrings. Let's see how this goes. It went well. Sunny was not doing much better against the murderous hurricane of steel, wearing the beautiful human face of Morgan of Valor, but he did manage to slow her down a little. Morgan slowed down not because she felt pressured by his sudden change of techniques, but because she was fascinated by it. Her raven-black hair swept back, and her simple tunic rippling from the wind, risen by their clash. She pierced him with a burning vermilion gaze. Her red lips moved. Interesting, very interesting. Morgan was not addressing Sunny, but more so speaking to herself. After that, she changed her strategy as well. Before, Morgan was all offense, all sharp edges, and a relentless barrage of calculated but devastating strikes. Now, she was moving more deliberately, not really holding back, but also not pursuing an overwhelming defeat of the enemy at all costs. It was as if Morgan was afraid to break him too soon. Sunny did not really know how to feel about that. How well, that's a new feeling. They clashed, their swords weaving a cacophonous but strangely beautiful melody of hissing and clangor. At the side of the dojo, Cassie turned her head slightly, listening. Sunny had long beaten his record of holding out against Morgan for 36 seconds. A minute passed, then another. He was still solidly standing on his 2 feet, and even though his breathing was growing a little labored from the terrible strain of the intense fight, his stamina was far from running out. In the middle of a particularly furious exchange, when they were close to each other, Morgan suddenly asked, "That style, who taught you?" Sunny struck at the hilt of her sword, aiming to sever her fingers, and answered hoarsely, "No one taught me. I just learned it from a nightmare creature." She easily avoided his strike and punished it by aiming a thrust at his heart. A smile appeared on her face. "In the nightmare." Sunny hesitated, considering how much he could reveal. He had fought the Barrow Wraiths as mongrel, after all, but then again, no one else had gotten a proper measure of their battle skill, and he had faced countless nightmare gates later in Antarctica, most of them undocumented. No, in front of a nightmare gate. Morgan's smile widened. "You're a fast learner, then." She seemed to have gotten a good grasp on the essence of the primal battle style he was using, which translated into her attacks becoming more purposeful. She was probing and testing, forcing him to reveal more facets of the technique, all of them, ideally. Which did not quite suit Sunny. It was too soon, he could not have her growing bored yet. He needed to impress her some more before losing, so that the impression he made lasted. Without giving Morgan any warning, he commanded his shadow Takai to change in the middle of a swing. The shadow flowed, turning into a great giant. It was still a 2-handed sword, but this one was straight and double-edged, much more suitable for thrusts, slightly more versatile and supremely mobile. The swing staggered unexpectedly and turned into a thrust, catching Morgan by surprise. She moved with the grace of a dancer, pulling her head out of the way. A strand of wavy black hair was cut and glided through the air. Ah, devious. Despite the outraged tone, her vibrant eyes were shining with excitement. Technically, Sunny had just cheated. They had agreed to leave their ascended abilities unused, after all. But that was fine. Cheating was exactly what an exalted legacy would expect an outskirt rat to do. And honestly, it was also what a person from the outskirts would actually do. It was also what a fighter in a real battle would not shy away from, which was why Sunny thought that Morgan was bound to enjoy his little twist. Instead of answering, he attacked, turning his giant into a spear. There were a few weapon forms that he had trained creating well enough to summon them on the fly. The only one he had reasons to avoid was the Odachi, since that was what he had used the last time he fought Morgan. Her smile grew wider. They fought, putting the armored plates of the dojo under more and more strain. At some point, one of them even started to crack. Sonny used it to his advantage, launching a deliberate strike while his opponent was slightly less sure-footed. Pushing the tip of her spear aside, Morgan pivoted, shifting her weight to one leg. The other suddenly whipped into the air, delivering a lightning-fast, picture-perfect roundhouse kick to his head. Sonny barely had time to react, pulling the spear slightly back and raising its butt to solidly block the kick with the shaft. Morgan's alabaster shin connected with the matte black surface of the shadow spear and cut straight through it, as if it was not as strong as an ascended weapon would be. Sonny's eyes widened slightly. Crap! It seemed that Morgan had decided to start using more of her aspect abilities as well. There was nothing really for him to do but accept the blow and hope that she was not planning to decapitate him. The kick had lost none of its power after cutting the spear. The moment Morgan's foot connected with his jaw, it was as if he had been hit by a siege ram. Sonny momentarily saw stars. He was thrown aside and staggered, barely managing to maintain some semblance of balance. Not good, no. Actually very good. This is exactly what I wanted. Time to be defeated. He overplayed his disorientation a little and waited for the follow-up strike to come. But it didn't. When Sonny regained the ability to see clearly a second later, he saw a hint of guilt on Morgan's face. She was looking at him with a resigned expression. "Ah, damn it, sorry, I forgot myself for a moment. I have a healer at hand." Then she paused and stared at him with a slightly startled expression. It was strange to see Morgan surprised. You're not cut." Sonny rubbed his cheek, which was still numb. He was going to have a nasty bruise, that was for sure, but the marble shell seemed to have withstood Morgan's aspect ability. No, not quite. She had probably released the ability after slicing through the spear. But her flaw, what Sonny suspected to be her flaw, remained. He grimaced, then moved his jaw side to side and answered in an even tone. "No, why would I be cut? Do I look fragile? Well, I'm not. I'm quite sturdy, in fact." Morgan stared at him for a bit, a strange expression on her face. Eventually, her lips twisted into a light smile. "That you are. I'll remember that for our next spar. This one sadly has to come to an end. Thank you for a wonderful duel, Master Sunless." She glanced at her training sword, then calmly turned around and went to place it back in the case. Sonny rubbed his cheek again, feeling a bit of dull pain seep through the numbness, and looked at her back. "Seems like it worked. That is what I call a job well done. Beautifully, really. Ah, I guess that is what they call suffering from success." The spar with Morgan left Sonny feeling sore and contemplative. The soreness quickly dissipated thanks to his ascended physique and the shroud of dusk, but the ponderous mood remained. Some time later, he was sitting in his small office, ignoring the paperwork he had to fill out in favor of idly staring at the wall. That fight of theirs was not exactly illuminating, but it had provided him with a lot of food for thought. First of all, Sonny was reminded of what true legacies represented. Over the years, he had forgotten the feeling of awe and reverence mundane people had toward the distant, powerful legacy clans, the austere warrior caste that produced the best and most valiant champions of humanity. That existed solely for battling the nightmare spell, or was supposed to, at least. He couldn't be blamed. Sonny had grown immensely strong himself, and had crossed paths with all kinds of powerful creatures, from ancient saints to titans. He had even brushed against actual divinities like Weaver, Nether, and Hope. It was not surprising that the fearsome reputation of the legacies faded a bit in comparison. But the legacy clans, and especially the three great clans, were still authorities in terms of personal power and combat prowess. They were in no way inferior to the ancient Awaken of the past, and in fact seemed to be superior in many ways, the most important ways. Legacies, and all modern Awaken by extension, were much harsher, much more extreme, and much better tempered than those from the ancient times. That was because the legacy clans were forged in a much more hellish world. They had risen to resist the nightmare spell, and were shaped into a force to be reckoned with by its terrible pressure. Morgan had reminded Sonny about that. It was no coincidence that the two most dangerous people he knew, Nephi's and Mordred, were products of the legacy culture. Among the three of them, it was Sonny who was an outlier, which brought him to the second avenue of thought, his own power. Sonny would have lied to himself if he said that he wasn't upset about his loss, even though he understood that a good defeat was much more beneficial as far as his goals were concerned. A small and unreasonable part of his mind still desired to win. No one liked to lose, and Sonny especially hated the thought of losing to a member of a great clan. He deeply resented them. After all, being defeated by someone he disdained was a bitter pill to swallow. But swallow it he did. It was one thing to pretend to be weak in front of Morgan, but the truth of the matter was that she was simply too strong. Even the current Sonny, with all his advantages, would find it hard to contend with that level of strength in a direct confrontation. And while he was resourceful and had ways of avoiding such a confrontation, Morgan had all the boundless resources of clan valor behind her, as well. So even in that regard, she was a dire threat. Sonny remembered what Jet had told him once, years ago. No one survives in the dream realm alone. Her words had always held true, but now they seemed especially poignant. Sonny had grown powerful, much more powerful than he ever imagined being, but he was still just one man. In front of a collective like a great clan, his personal power seemed insignificant. Worse still, that collective served as a gatekeeper to greater strength. No one could even become a saint without their permission, unless that person wanted to be hunted down and slain in retaliation for their defiance. There were ways to grow more powerful without achieving transcendence, though. The last thing the spar with Morgan made Sonny think about was the duel itself. He slowly replayed it in his mind, considering what he could have done better and what mistakes he could have avoided. The list was both endless and pointless. Everything was easier in hindsight. It was achieving the best result in the moment that was hard. Still, it was good to review his performance, as well as that of his enemy. Sonny spent some time staring at the wall and thinking back to the duel. A giant was not a good choice for that strike. Here I did not need to saturate that group of muscles with essence. It was just a waste. Should have anticipated the effect of the kick better. As he analyzed their fight, his thoughts inevitably drifted to what could have been done differently. I wonder how Morgan would have fared against me if I used the shadow shell. Sonny tried to construct such a fight in his mind, replacing himself with a version that was 3 meters high and possessed 4 arms. Would Morgan have still held an advantage? Not in physical prowess, that was for sure. However, he was not certain if the outcome would have been different. Legacies were first and foremost abomination slayers, after all. Anvil's daughter had been trained to face all kinds of nightmare creatures since childhood. A 4-armed fiend would not faze her at all. What about some other shell? Sonny was currently limited to one form, that of the shadow spawn, because that was what he knew best. But in theory, he could create the shell of any creature. He just needed to know the creature well enough, perfectly in fact, and that was not easy to achieve. A thoughtful frown appeared on his face. Is it true, though, that I can create the shell of any creature? It was true in theory, but that theory broke instantly when faced with reality. Take Morgan, for example, or any other human for that matter. Creating a shell, a human had to be easier, because Sonny was one himself and knew how human bodies operated perfectly well. But how would that even work? The shadow spawn shell worked because the 4-armed fiend was much larger than Sonny, and thus he could form its body around his own. But other humans, with rare exceptions, were more or less of the same approximate size as him. There was no space for a human shell to be formed. There were creatures smaller than humans, too. The current ravenous fiend, for example. Even if Sonny studied his shadow for a while, he wouldn't be able to create a shell of the little critter. So in reality, the shadow shell was limited in what it could recreate. A strange expression suddenly appeared on Sonny's face. He blinked a couple of times. Unless, Sonny remained motionless for a while, then chuckled. No, that's crazy, it would never work. Then he stared at the wall some more. Would it? No way. The thought that had crept into his mind, while he was thinking about the limitations of the shadow shell, was so out there that it seemed utterly ridiculous. But the more he thought about it, the fewer reasons to discard it he saw. No, that's a bit too strange even for me. And yet, he could not find a logical reason for why it wouldn't be true. Sonny hesitated for a while longer, then furtively looked around. Then he cleared his throat, stood up and left the office. If he wanted to test this bizarre theory, he needed to do it somewhere more private. He left the Valor compound and made his way to the nearby dormitory, where most of the government staff still remaining within the siege capital lived. There, he entered his living quarters, which were a bit more spacious and had better amenities than that of both mundane and awakened government workers, and locked the door behind him. Being an ascended had its perks. Sonny sent his 4 shadows to stand watch, 2 outside the apartment, 2 within, and stood there for a few minutes, mentally going over what he was about to do. It didn't seem to be dangerous, just really weird. The principle was simple. Sonny had mastered 3 steps of shadow dance to date. The essence of his battle art was shapelessness and formlessness. It allowed him to shadow an enemy, copying the very essence of their combat technique. After doing so, he could predict their movements, the flow of their battle intent, and even their thoughts. The first step allowed him to shadow simpler battle styles. He had achieved that breakthrough while fighting Nephis in the Crimson Spire. The second step vastly elevated his comprehension of the fundamental principles that governed all battle techniques, allowing him to shadow much more sophisticated styles and do it much faster. It also gave him a glimpse of an intuitive understanding of the more esoteric components of the truly advanced battle arts, those created and used by the awakened, thus incorporating special ways of guiding soul essence through one's body. He had achieved that step after collecting a vast library of techniques in the dreamscape, which culminated during his first duel with Morgan. The inspiration Sonny had received after being decimated by the Princess of War pushed him to a breakthrough. The third step was the hardest one yet. Sonny had started his journey toward mastery of it by expanding his horizons and starting to shadow not only humans, but also nightmare creatures. In the bloody arena of the Red Colosseum, he had submerged himself into their perverted, demented, rabid minds, which allowed him to intuitively feel what the abominations he fought would do, but also put his own sense of self, if not his very soul, at risk. The third step of shadow dance was much more demanding on the practitioner. It required one to truly accept the formless nature of the shadows and let go of their actual self, which, of course, posed the risk of losing it forever. Sonny had made that dangerous breakthrough after being trapped in an endless procession of harrowing dreams by nightmare and having his personal memories blocked. In the end, he had pulled the dissipating pieces of his true self back together by using his true name. It served as an anchor for what made Sonny an individual, and through it, he was able to advance his mastery of shadow dance without losing himself. That third breakthrough enhanced the speed with which he could comprehend the battle intent and combat intelligence of those beings he shadowed even further, allowed him to actually perceive the flow of essence through their bodies as opposed to just feeling it intuitively, and even gave him the ability to sometimes predict their thoughts. The fourth step. That was where Sonny had hit the wall. Shadow dance was his aspect legacy, but it was also something he had to invent all on his own, with no one guiding him. As such, he wasn't even sure what the correct path was, let alone how to take the next step on it. He only felt that the next steps of shadow dance went far beyond battle techniques, and would be much, much harder to conceive and master for that reason. However, while he had stagnated in mastering shadow dance, he had achieved progress in other aspects of his personal power. The culmination of it was the shadow shell, a powerful tool he had created by bringing together various facets of his skills, attributes, and aspect abilities. Shadow dance also played a role in him being able to create shells of other creatures. In fact, its role was perhaps the most important. Without deep comprehension of the desired form, Sonny would never be able to construct it from the shadows. And that was what his aspect legacy allowed him to do. However, there was a limitation to Shadow Shell. After all, shadows were truly shapeless and formless, while Sonny was not. Even if he had managed to make his mind supremely malleable, he still possessed a human body. No matter how much training he had put into making it as flexible and adaptable as possible, it was still a relatively rigid thing. But what if he added another ingredient to the mix? Right now, Shadow Shell existed as a combination of his dormant ability, Shadow Control, his ascended ability, Shadow Manifestation, and his aspect legacy, Shadow Dance. His awakened ability, Shadow Step, was missing from the equation. And that, perhaps, was the reason for the limitations Sonny had to deal with. Well, let's just try this. If he succeeded, Sonny felt that he might just discover a direction that would eventually lead him to the next step of Shadow Dance. Breathing in deeply, he activated Shadow Step and dissolved into the shadows. There in their dark embrace, Sonny himself was a shadow, formless and shapeless. But he did not need to be. While fighting the ravenous fiend, he had changed his form in this state to possess sharp claws. His shadow form was, too, infinitely malleable. So, Sonny concentrated and started to slowly change his shadow form into the shape of himself. It was a strange endeavor to turn himself into a shadow, only to then turn the shadow into himself. But that was exactly what Sonny wanted to do. It was a bit like constructing the shell of the shadow spawn, only instead of shaping the shadows around his body, Sonny was shaping his shadow body, instead. Of course, he knew the shape of himself the best, which was why recreating it was much easier than summoning the fiendish form of the shadow spawn. Eventually, the incorporeal shadow assumed the form of Sonny's body. It had arms and legs, a torso, fingers and toes, and a face that was a perfect rendition of Sonny's face. It matched his physical body perfectly, not that it needed to. Starting from becoming himself was just the easiest thing he could do for that test. Satisfied with the result of the shaping, Sonny spent some time in the dark embrace of the shadows, drifting. I wonder. Then he took a deep mental breath, activated Shadow Manifestation, and manifested himself back into the waking world through it. A matte, jet-black version of Sonny was standing in the middle of the room. He did not move for a while, frozen like a statue, then raised his hands slightly and looked at them with a strange expression. His fingers moved. Well, that's... The jet-black Sonny scratched the back of his head, then halted for a moment and tentatively touched his hair. The mere fact that he had hair was a surprise. That's certainly something. He felt extremely strange. Sonny was fundamentally a human. When using Shadow Step, he could assume the form of an incorporeal shadow, then turn himself back to his original form. That was not what he had done today, however. Today, he had become a shadow, and then manifested himself into a corporeal form without turning back into a human. So, what he was right now was. I'll be damned if I know what I am right now. A human inhabiting a human-shaped vessel made of shadows. A shadow brazenly wandering the human world in the form of a person. or something else entirely. Descriptions aside, his current state was a curious one. Because of how faithful the recreation was to the original, Sonny felt more or less like himself. His range of motion, strength, and agility remained the same. His shadow form was ascended, just like his human body, so it was just as powerful and resilient. There were differences too, of course. The most obvious one was the change in his perception. His shadow sense seemed to have become sharper, while his vision was now less pronounced. He couldn't see colors, either, just like in the second nightmare, when inhabiting the shadow spawn. This was familiar territory for him. Less familiar was the actual composition of his new and strange shadow body. It was a faithful copy, but not an exact one. It couldn't be. Although the jet-black Sonny looked and acted like Sonny, he was still a manifested shadow. As such, he operated on a different set of principles. The recreation did follow some underlying principles of how a corporeal creature was supposed to be, but the similarity was shallow. He did not have a beating heart, or any internal organs for that matter. And although there was a rough structure to his form, with something similar to bones being connected to something similar muscles, there was no blood running through his veins. There were no veins either. At best, there were essence pathways. How did it all work? Hell if Sonny knew. It did work, though. Perplexed, he glanced at the two shadows that were hiding in the corners of the room. What do you guys think? The haughty shadow seemed completely befuddled. It stared at him for a while, then raised a hand, as if wanting to say something. Eventually, though, the arrogant guy simply shook his head in confusion. The creepy shadow, in an uncharacteristic display of emotions, scratched the back of its head, puzzled. The jet-black Sonny smiled, revealing jet-black teeth. Yeah. After going through the training steps of shadow dance and examining his current state further, he discovered a few things. The first was that this corporeal shadow form was much more malleable than his human body. It could change its shape at will, of course. He needed to possess an excellent understanding of what he was turning it into for the end result to work. For example, Sonny could become a smaller version of himself. That, however, required some practice to master, since such a fundamental change affected a lot of things. He could become larger too, although there was a limit to how much, dictated by his rank and soul essence capacity. Less comprehensive changes were much easier. Sonny already knew how to possess 4 arms, so he could add 2 more to his existing ones with ease. The same went for claws, horns, a tail in the future. As his knowledge of various forms and shapes grew, he would be able to make more changes like that on the fly. The second discovery was that, while the corporeal shadow form was almost as resilient as his actual body, in the end, it still fell short. The reason for that was simple: the weaves. Neither blood weave nor bone weave persisted in this state, which left Sonny vulnerable. Interestingly enough, the marble shell still had an effect. In fact, it had even become more potent. That was because the effects of the stalwart trait were being applied to him twice. Shadows were innately connected to souls, to the extent that when Sonny was damaged in the form of a shadow, or one of his shadows was damaged, his soul would be damaged too. Therefore, the corporeal shadow form received the benefits of both the extremely high degree of physical protection and the high degree of protection from soul attacks that the stalwart trait provided, due to the fact that every attack against it was akin to a soul attack, which was not ideal. Sonny had a tendency to be wounded a lot, and if each wound was transferred directly to his soul, it would quickly collapse. No, that really won't do. Activating the mantle would surround the physical shadow form with an onyx carapace and make it much less prone to being damaged. But there was an even better solution. After all, Sonny had started this whole experiment for a reason. Even though the discovery promised to have much wider implications, the initial reason was to expand the limits of the shadow shell. After getting somewhat used to this new way of existence, Sunny called upon the deep shadows shrouding his room, manifesting them into the shadow spawn shell. Layers of shadows flowed up his jet-black body, wrapping tightly around it. Soon, a towering, four-armed fiend was standing in the middle of the room. This time felt different, though. Instead of being nestled within the shell, Sunny felt as if he had become an integral part of it. His own shadow form was still the heart and driving force of the horned creature, but it was as if he had actually become the fiend. The outer layers of the shadow spawn were like armor, and protected safely deep within was his vulnerable soul. Not bad. Combining these two abilities was a perfect way to both remove the limitations of the shadow shell and protect his soul from harm. If there was one negative side to this solution, though, it was that Sunny's essence was being consumed at twice the speed. He would not be able to sustain this double transformation for long. For now, in the future, though, as his soul grew more powerful, Sunny would most likely be able to use these abilities much better. And one day, perhaps, his soul would grow so vast and powerful that he would not need the protection of a shell at all. A few days went by in a flash. Nothing serious seemed to have happened, but grand and dire events were being set in motion in the shadows. Saint Madoc had transported several cohorts of Valor retainers into the dream realm and then disappeared. Of course, no one was told about his absence. In fact, Clan Valor made a good show of pretending that he was still around, supporting the awakened in the dream realm. It was a believable lie. Awakened, ascended, and saints were affected by the call all the same. If they traveled to the dream realm near a nightmare gate, they would be brought to the area surrounding the seed instead of to where their anchor was. However, there was a big difference when a transcendent was actually involved. That difference was that saints could return to the waking world by just using their innate powers, while awakened and masters needed to find a gateway to come back. Another, no less important distinction was that the pull of the call was not precise. If an awakened fell asleep near a gate, they could be transported right to where the seed was, but just as easily to a spot dozens of kilometers away. They could even be dropped right into the middle of a horde of hungry nightmare creatures. So, if a cohort of awakened wanted to use a nightmare gate as a pathway to the dream realm, they would be scattered over a large area and risk finding their doom long before reuniting with their fellow warriors. A saint could follow the call first, establish an anchor in a safe place, and then transport the members of the cohort there one by one. A saint could even clear the way to the seed if the cohort was truly planning to challenge it. That was how the nightmare gates that opened inside the human cities were usually dealt with, unless there was no one to challenge them. In that case, they were simply contained, surrounded by a fortified exclusion zone, and guarded day and night. So everyone had been led to believe that that was exactly what Whispering Blade was doing, guiding the awakened warriors of Clan Valor to the seeds of nightmare in order to conquer them. Sunny, however, knew better. He knew that Madoc actually left to infiltrate Song's territory and secretly take out Mordred. The awakened cohorts the fearsome saint had transported to the dream realm had been left to their own devices, presumably supporting Knight Shtad in pursuing a mysterious objective. The war between the great clans was starting in earnest. Blood had already been spilled, and much more of it was going to flow very soon. Sunny himself, meanwhile, had spent these days experimenting with his newfound ability. He was in a real rush of excitement about it, simply because the potential of the corporeal shadow form was all but limitless. In theory. In practice, there were still conditions to what he could do with it. For example, Sunny managed to turn himself into the Shadow Fiend without the help of the Shadow Shell, relying solely on his own form. That was more or less the extent of how large he could make himself, though. For now. It was also an inferior solution to calling upon the ambient shadows to become the outer layer of the spawn, since he was vulnerable without them. He also experimented with becoming smaller. That was a much easier change, although not without its limitations either. The smallest he managed to become was about the size of the imp, which induced quite a reaction from the little wretch. Sonny also tried other things, like staying more or less his natural size, but changing various aspects of his appearance. Facial features were easy to shift around, as were other things like the length of his hair, his body type, and so on. It would have been a great subterfuge tool, if not for the fact that all these permutations were still of a matte, jet-black color. I won't be masquerading as other people anytime soon. Of course, his experiments went beyond cosmetic changes. His interest was mostly combat and stealth, after all. So, Sonny started by adding 2 more arms to the corporeal shadow form, and transitioned to more extreme shape alterations from there. His ability to shapeshift was limited by his knowledge and experience. Sonny did well with smaller alterations, like adding sharp claws to his fingers or turning his teeth into wicked fangs. However, when he tried to grow wings, the result was borderline disastrous. He had never lived with wings on his back, did not know their anatomy and how it engaged with the rest of the body, and had the vaguest understanding of the principles of flight. So he had no hope of soaring in the sky like Kai or St. Tyrus anytime soon. Sonny was far away from becoming truly shapeless and formless. He did come closer to reaching that goal, though. The funniest thing he did, however, was fulfill his old desire to become taller. Granted, it too was not easy. When Sonny simply made himself larger, the proportions of his body seemed a bit off. When he elongated his limbs, the result was even more off-putting. Finding the right balance was really hard. He did manage to achieve an acceptable result, though, and was currently looking at himself through one of the shadows, giggling. Damn, it's such a pity Effie can't see me right now. The look on her face would be priceless, especially since she would be looking up at me. Oh gods, I can just imagine it. The tall version of Sonny was really weird. He wasn't sure that he liked its lanky silhouette that much. It was really amusing to see, though, especially because the corporeal shadow form was entirely matte black. Except for the hair. His hair was actually white, because Sonny had summoned the autumn leaf to see if it worked on him in this state. I should probably explore purchasing more cosmetic memories in the future. They seem to be working on this form, which can be of use. He glanced at himself one last time, then dove back into the shadows and emerged from them in his usual human form. Truth be told, while being a manifested shadow was certainly fun, he felt much more comfortable in his real body. It was nice, cozy, and familiar. He felt really rather attached to it. Some time later, Sonny was preparing to go to sleep, but then suddenly froze in the middle of washing up. His face grew cold and dark. Then a dangerous smile appeared on his lips. Well, well, what do we have here? A frightening darkness flooded his eyes. That was because a few moments ago, Sonny had felt something. Before, his perception had been split between 5 points of view, his own, and those of his 4 shadows. But then, a 6th perspective slowly came into focus, which meant that the 5th shadow had returned. The gloomy shadow was now within the walls of the siege capital, and that meant that the Assassin's Clan Song had sent were here. 2. Sir Amaran, one of the exalted knights of the great clan Valor, was standing on top of a newly constructed dormitory tower, looking at the expanse of the city below. There was a long stretch of industrial buildings between him and the looming barrier of the defensive wall that protected the siege capital from the ravages of the Chain of Nightmares. There were plenty of civilian shelters and dormitories, too. With the start of the evacuation, even industrial areas like this one had been put to use, accommodating numerous refugees. The refugees were moving far below him like tiny ants. The thunderous booms of firing railguns did not seem to spoil their moods. After months of continuous siege, the people must have grown used to its clamor. Knight Amarin grimaced. Collateral damage will be high. But that was war. None of these people would have had to die if the enemy had abided by the agreement to keep the hostilities away from the cities. But now that the Song clan had made their move, the hands of noble warriors of valor were tied. The lives of mundane humans were like water anyway. No matter how much he sacrificed to achieve victory, it was just a drop in the ocean. Amarin didn't feel happy about the human cost of his inevitable victory, but he was also not particularly sad. Knowing what he knew, their deaths were insignificant. He heard light footsteps behind him and looked over his shoulder. One of his awakened approached, bearing news. There was an expression of dark excitement on her face. "We have confirmed the location, sir." He nodded. The band of Song's assassins had infiltrated the siege capital with one of the supply convoys. The original staff had been slain, and the impostors assumed their identities. After getting past the gates, they disappeared into the chaos of the overpopulated city without a trace. Or so they thought. In truth, Valor had long anticipated this attack. The subterfuge the assassins employed was pointless. They had only managed to enter the city because that was where Lady Morgan wanted them. It would have been easier and much more bloodless to deal with the servants of the Queen of Worms at the gates, but then some of them could escape. So, they were allowed to enter deeper into the trap. And now, Knight Amarin was entrusted with the honor of delivering Valor's retribution upon the wretched cowards. What did it matter if there was collateral damage? He turned around and glanced at the valiant awakened gathered on the roof. With warriors like these fighting by his side, the dogs of Song stood no chance. A cold smile appeared on Amarin's lips. "Prepare, then. We strike as soon as they make their move." In a dark and empty production hall of a decommissioned underground factory, a group of people were sitting around a ghostly fire. Its flames were blue and burned without producing any smoke. A pleasant fragrance was spreading from the fire, but the gathered people did not seem to notice. The leader of the group was a woman wearing simple civilian clothes, with a pale scar crossing her otherwise beautiful face. She was Ascended Morrow, a retainer of the great clan Song. Currently, Morrow was listening to quiet scratching sounds that seemed to be coming from somewhere under the floor of the factory. The faces of the awakened around her were a little tense. There was a newcomer among them, a man in the uniform of the evacuation army that listened to the sounds, too, his eyes growing a little wide. He was their contact within the siege capital. After a few moments of silence, the man spoke. "That thing, it's not going to break free, is it?" Ascended Morrow smiled. "Of course it will, when I command it." She lingered for a second and then added, "Have no worry, though. The thralls of Sister Beastmaster are very obedient. Granted, this one is more powerful than her usual pets." The man chuckled wryly. "Oh, I see. Good, then." Poor fool did not even know that he, too, was one of the thralls. "Anyway, have your people completed the preparations?" The soldier hesitated for a bit, then pointed at the map being projected by his communicator. "Yes, that tunnel right there. It will be empty for about 24 hours starting from now. As you can see, my lady, the tunnel stretches all the way to the inner city without crossing any other major logistical hubs. It is also wide enough to transport that thing you brought to where you need it. The last few kilometers leading up to the Valor compound are too well guarded, though." Morrow shook her head. "Leave that to us. Worst case scenario, we will be forced to unleash the thrall a few minutes earlier than planned and let it tear its way toward the compound above ground. Summer Night won't be able to make it back from the wall in time. And since Whispering Blade seems to have indeed gone to the dream realm, the casualties the creature will cause Valor will be severe." She would have loved nothing more than to slaughter the ignoble hypocrites serving the King of Swords personally. But sadly, her mission was simply to deliver Beastmaster's present to Morgan of Valor, striking both at the enemy's troops and reputation. After all, what kind of incompetent fool would allow a nightmare creature to rampage in the middle of their city? The man cleared his throat. "Ah, but I must warn you, my lady. The awakened of Clan Valor seemed restless recently. A few cohorts vanished without a trace. I don't think that we've been made, but it's better not to linger." Ascended Morrow studied his face for a while, then nodded. "Sound advice. We were going to wait until Summer Night engages with the terror that is approaching the city, but our diviner has turned ineffective all of a sudden. With this added uncertainty, it is better to accelerate the plan." She glanced at her awakened and smiled. "Time to act, my kin. Prepare to enter the tunnel. You two, go relay my order to those watching the creature. They need to get it ready for transportation as soon as possible. We are moving to attack." On the first floor of the dormitory tower, Knight Amarin was surrounded by the awakened warriors of valor. One of them was making a report. "The enemy seems to have started moving. They must be aiming to enter the network of logistical tunnels under the city. If they do, catching them all would be problematic." Amarin nodded. "Indeed, the wretches can't be allowed to burrow deeper underground. No, we need to force them to the surface. Get ready to attack. We'll blast through the factory roof and slaughter them all." There was a shadow watching him say these words. There was a shadow watching Ascended Morrow give orders to the assassins as well. Some distance away, Sonny sighed and gulped down what was left of his coffee. Then he thanked the owner of a refugee cafe, rose and walked out, yawning lazily. It was time for him to begin, too. In the decommissioned underground factory, the ghostly fire had been extinguished. Dozens of awakened were moving, preparing to depart. All of them had summoned luminous memories, and the dancing lights made the shadows populating the vast production hall reluctantly retreat. Ascended Morrow was standing in front of a sturdy wall, looking at it with a somber expression. Eventually, she nodded and glanced at one of her subordinates. "This is the spot, isolate it." The awakened nodded and raised his hands. Soon, a strange silence fell upon them. It was not the mundane kind of silence many memories could create, though, instead, it was the manifestation of an ability that could cut a stretch of space from the rest of the world, subduing all tremors and sounds that would escape it. The city was constantly being monitored by countless seismic sensors on account of nightmare creatures often burrowing underground, so nothing less would do if they wanted to remain unnoticed. Satisfied, Morrow raised a hand and clicked her fingers. A moment later, a violent sonic boom resounded, and a large portion of the wall in front of her shattered into dust. Behind it, an entrance to a tunnel was revealed, drowned in darkness. Cold wind entered the production hall, making the awakened shiver. Even Morrow herself suddenly felt uneasy, for whatever reason. With a frown, she lowered her hand and said evenly, "Clear the debris. The entrance should be wide enough for the cage to fit. Second cohort, scout out the tunnel and make sure that there are no blockages there." 7 awakened jumped down into the darkness, while the rest of her subordinates got busy preparing the hole she created for the creature's cage. The cohort in charge of keeping an eye on the abominations was going to bring it any minute now. Lowering the massive containment device down would not be easy, but they had come prepared. The man in the uniform of the evacuation army watched the process with a worried face. After a minute, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, I will be going then. My job here is done." Morrow glanced at him indifferently. "Go." The thrall was of no use anymore. Their escape from the city would be handled by a different sleeper cell. If it was up to her, she would have gotten rid of the man and his people to clean up loose ends, but they could become useful in the future. Even mundanes could do a lot of harm if armed with the right tools. Although Morrow felt it was beneath her to use vulgar weapons of the bygone era, in the grand scheme of things, not even crude instruments like that could be neglected. Others might not have known, but she understood what was at stake. The man disappeared, and the entrance to the tunnel was cleared. Their exodus from the underground factory was being dragged out, however, because the creature cage was slow to arrive. Morrow felt irritated. What is taking them so long? She thought about sending someone else to fetch the guard cohort, then decided against it and took out a special memory. Although using it required some essence to be spent, right now, time was more important. The memory was called the Reaching Hand, and consisted of a scattering of finger bones. Each of the 4 cohorts under Morrow's command was in possession of a phalanx, and she held the 5th one. People who touched the ancient phalanxes could communicate with each other across small distances. Ironically, the reach of the Reaching Hand was not large. However, it possessed the unique quality of being shielded from most divination abilities, which was very valuable for the sort of mission they were currently on. Morrow gripped the bone and spoke, mentally connecting to the cohort that guarded the creature cage on another level of the factory. "Mont, where are you?" Soon, the leader of the cohort responded, her voice resonating in the vast production hall. "Sister Morrow, we are guarding the creature. Has something happened?" Morrow suddenly felt a bad premonition. "What do you mean? Have you not received my order?" Awakened Mont lingered. "I am sorry, sister. What order?" She gritted her teeth. "I sent 2. But then Morrow grew silent. The 2 awakened she had sent to relay the order. Why were they not back yet? She had assumed that they had stayed with Mont to help move the cage, but why would they? "Not good." She hesitated for a split second, then said calmly, "Get the cage here right now." What had happened? Had the enemy already discovered their location and silently infiltrated the factory? How could they, without disturbing any of the wards she had placed on all the entrances? If the soldiers of valor were already here? She glanced at her subordinates and barked, "Assemble into a battle formation. Prepare for an attack." A moment later, Morrow reached through the phalanx to the cohort that had gone forward to scout out the tunnel. "Rika's, return immediately." There was a short span of silence, and then she heard the familiar voice of awakened Rika's. "Yes, sister, we are coming." Concerned, the warriors of Song swiftly assembled into a defensive formation. They stood near the entrance to the tunnel, looking nervously into the darkness of the production hall. The factory was silent. Soon the silence was disturbed by a loud noise. With a screeching sound of rusted metal, a cargo elevator arrived. Its doors opened, revealing a massive cage of enchanted alloy. 7 awakened used all their strength to roll the cage forward. Morrow secretly let out a relieved sigh. At least the creature is secured. Now they were only missing the 2 messengers and the cohort that he'd entered the tunnel. "Rika's, how long before you arrive?" There was a stretch of silence again before he responded, "Sister, we are coming." Morrow frowned. The familiar voice persisted, We are." Something was very, very wrong with it. "We are coming." The voice, it did not come from the phalanx. Instead, it came directly from the dark entrance of the tunnel. She looked into the hole, seeing only a boundless expanse of shadows. Then something rolled out of the darkness. It was the severed head of awakened Rika's. Morrow stared at the severed head for a split moment, feeling cold terror creep into her heart. The clean cut, the hollow emptiness of his dead eyes, the dark entrance into the tunnel behind. Were they all dead? A whole cohort of experienced, battle-hardened awakened warriors of the great clan Song, wiped out in such a short span of time without making even a single sound. Had a human done that? No, that was impossible. Only Whispering Blade would have been capable of slaughtering them in such a manner. But then, Madoc would never lower himself to play with his prey. What kind of abomination was it then? How had the dogs of valor allowed a monster like that to live freely under their city? Then Morrow scowled. Why was she scared? What was there to be scared of? Neither death nor nightmare creatures had ever frightened her before. Her people seemed to be shaken, too, so unbecoming of the elites of a great clan. A mental attack. The creature must have been employing some kind of beguilement. She growled. Activate the mental resistance enchantments. At the same time, she raised her hand and clicked her fingers, sending a devastating sonic shockwave into the tunnel. A deafening boom rolled through the production hall, and a fountain of stone dust and debris shot out of the dark entrance. The awakened of song poured essence into the protective charms they carried. Instantly, it was as if they could breathe again. The memory of terror still lingered, though, gnawing at their willpower. There were 20 of them left, gathered in a circular defensive formation that had no blind zones, with the massive cage placed in the center. Morrow stared in the direction of the tunnel tensely, wondering whether her attack caught the creature or not. When the echoes of the sonic boom died down and an unnerving silence settled over the production hall, she lingered for a moment, then gave the order to dismiss luminous memories. Trapped in a circle of light, they were too vulnerable. Instead of relying on natural vision, the messengers of song sacrificed a bit of essence to activate enchantments that granted them the ability to see in the dark. Instantly, the whole production hall was unveiled before them. Nothing could escape their gazes. But the hall was empty. There was nothing within its dark expanse except for old machines and shadows. Morrow raised her hand, brought her thumb and middle finger together, and then said loudly, "Show yourself, creature." There was a moment of silence, and then a moment more. And then the severed head laying in the dust beside her spoke, its mouth unmoving. "Creature, creature, creature." It spoke in Morrow's own voice. The awakened threw unsettled glances at the head of Rika's, which stared back at them with hollow eyes. "What kind of a trick?" "Don't pay any attention to it. It's a distraction." She snarled, then looked away from the morbid visage of the speaking severed head and concentrated on the production hall, trying to predict where the attack would come from. The awakened follow her example, too. Except for one. The man who had been the furthest from the entrance to the tunnel swayed slightly. Then his head slid from his shoulders and fell to the floor, rolling through the dust as the body toppled behind it. In that short instant, when everyone had gotten distracted by the creature mimicking Morrow's voice, another awakened was mercilessly slain. And now there were only 19 of them. Damn it! Morrow clapped her hands together, unleashing the full force of her aspect. A destructive sonic shockwave spread like a ring from the formation of the awakened, obliterating a large swath of the production hall. The concrete floor cracked, the old machines were torn apart, the steel conveyor belts were ripped, and shreds of alloy flew away like jagged bullets. Nothing within the circle of destruction could have escaped unscathed. In the silence that followed, the severed head of Rika spoke again, unperturbed. "Pay, pay, pay." Ascended Morrow gritted her teeth, calmly analyzing the situation. Where was the enemy? What were its capabilities? There was something else beneath her calmness, though. A slither of fear. This time, one that had nothing to do with an insidious outside influence. A moment later, two things happened. First, a loud metallic click came from somewhere within the defensive formation, from the massive cage that contained the enthralled abomination. Second, a section of the production hall's ceiling suddenly collapsed, and armored figures poured through the breach. A short time earlier, many levels above the production hall of the underground factory, Knight Amarin was standing in the middle of a wide corridor. He was surrounded by awakened of valor who were stealthily moving forward. A woman in light armor, fashioned out of abomination, leather was making a report. "Sir, we have dismantled the outer layers of the detection wards. The enemy should be right below us by now, but moving further unnoticed will be hard. The elevator shafts are especially problematic." He looked down, then nodded. "Try your best." His subordinate moved to return to her task, but at that moment the floor trembled slightly. Amarin frowned. "What? Why would the enemy abandon caution now?" He raised his head to give an order, but at that moment something flashed in the corner of his eye. Amarin swiftly turned, noticing the back of a small creature, some sort of a gremlin scurrying into the darkness. His face darkened. "Our presence has been discovered." There was another tremor, this one much stronger than the first. The worms had to be trying to collapse the wall of a tunnel in a hurry, hopping to escape. If so, he was going to have to disappoint them. Amarin had been planning to proceed further down quietly, even if it took more time. But now that such an approach was off the table, there was a need to accelerate things. There was a sword on his belt and a war hammer on his back. Unsheathing the sword and pulling the hammer from its loop, Amarin bellowed, "Warriors of valor with me." Then he called upon his aspect and slammed the war hammer into the floor. A wave of crushing force traveled downward, piercing through multiple levels of the underground factory and opening a ravaged path to the main production hall. Without a moment of hesitation, Knight Amarin grinned and jumped down into the dark breach. Death to the enemy, let no one escape. Some of his warriors were going to use flight memories to follow, others would rappel down. But Amarin himself had no need for these measures. He simply plummeted through the breach, falling into the darkness like a meteor of steel. Reaching the main production hall, he thrust his sword forward. Invisible force flowed off the blade, forming a brittle field below him. A series of them, actually, each as thin as a sheet of paper. Breaking through these invisible panes of force allowed Amarin to slow his fall. He landed on the floor in a roll and jumped to his feet a split second later, ready to attack and carve out a path for his men to follow. If everything went right, the enemy would have been surprised by the collapsing ceiling and the sudden arrival of a Valor Knight. Even if their shock did not last long, a few seconds would be enough. But he was not given a few seconds. Nothing went right from the start. As soon as Amarin and the first of his warriors landed, they were greeted by a devastating sonic boom. He felt a powerful shockwave travel through his body, almost strong enough to cause his organs to burst. Luckily, he was resilient enough to withstand it. The same couldn't be said for the awakened behind him. With pained screams, they dropped down, blood flowing from every orifice on their bodies. Dead. It was as though the enemy had been waiting in a battle formation, ready to defend themselves. "How dare you?" As more and more armored awakened poured through the breach, Amarin roared and dashed forward. There was something strange, though, at the last moment before his lunge, it was as if a drop of blood fell on his helmet from somewhere above. He did not pay it any attention. In front of him was a loose circle of awakened protecting something that resembled a large alloy crate. There was some kind of abominable monster inside. No doubt, bringing a nightmare creature inside a human city was just what the witch Beastmaster would do. And allowing the crate to be smuggled into the city despite knowing about its contents was exactly what Valor would do, if it meant leaving the assassins no chance to escape. Amarin's gaze quickly found the leader of the Song infiltration team, a striking woman whose beauty could neither be hidden by unassuming civilian clothes nor blemished by an ugly scar running across her face. His eyes narrowed slightly. Maro. There were not that many masters in the world, and even fewer served the great clans directly. Of course, Amarin knew her. The scarred woman was a powerful opponent. Not as powerful as he was, of course. Their eyes met, and before she could click her fingers, Amarin struck with both his sword and his hammer, sending two horizontal waves of force flying forward, one cutting, the other crushing. The waves collided with a sonic shockwave in the middle of the hall, producing a roaring explosion. Bits of concrete shot outward like shrapnel. It was then that his mind registered a few incongruities in the scene before him. First of all, the entrance to the tunnel had already been revealed. However, the enemy did not appear to be in a hurry to enter it, as if wary of the darkness beyond. Secondly, the main production hall was in a sorry state even before the explosion, seemingly ravaged by Morrow's powers. There were also too few awakened in her formation, no more than 20. 4 full cohorts of song infiltrators had crossed the city gate checkpoint, so what happened to the rest of them? And lastly, there was a gruesomely beheaded body on the floor in front of Song's warriors, one of their own. Just what the hell was going on? There was something else, too. For a moment, just before the waves of force collided and a cloud of dust obscured the view, Amarin thought that he had noticed something. A vague silhouette that moved on top of the massive cage, dissolving into darkness. An archer. Lowering his head to protect the slit of his helmet's visor, he burst through the cloud of dust and raised his sword. No matter what tricks the enemy had in store, he was going to cut them all down, especially now that he knew that the numbers were even more on their side than expected. Knight Amarin had no doubt. The main priorities are Morrow and the caged creature. Morrow silently cursed. So it was valor all along. It seemed that they had walked into a trap. The servants of the King of Swords had turned out to be more cunning than expected. Someone had been waiting in the tunnel all along, and now the cavalry had arrived to finish the job. Who had been compromised? It had to be the thrall responsible for clearing the path to the inner city. But it did not matter now. The enemy blundered in their attack, maybe because she had decided to accelerate the plan. The invisible assassin had revealed their presence too early, and instead of being surprised by the sudden breach of the production hall, the messengers of song were ready for it. Which was why Morrow managed to slay several of valor, awakened the moment they landed on the floor. Not their leader, though, a giant of a man wearing heavy armor and wielding both a sword and a war hammer. Her heart grew slightly cold. Knight Amarin. Even among the Knights of Valor, this zealot was known for his power and ruthlessness. He was a bit too straight of a tool, though. A man blessed with incredible strength, but very little imagination. A vicious smile appeared on Morrow's face. I'll have a chance to bring back a fine trophy, then. She sent a sonic shockwave to prevent the knight from decimating the formation of Songs awakened, then swiftly looked at the breach. Just how many soldiers had Amarin brought to kill them? It was strange. There were not nearly as many as she would have expected. 1 cohort, 2, 3, 4, and that was it. If Valor knew in advance about the infiltration team, why would they only send that many? And there was something else. Instead of more cohorts of awakened, streams of blood flowed from the breach, crimson drops falling like rain. The soldiers of valor who had already landed seemed shaken because of that. Morrow hesitated. What is the meaning of this? Her hesitation only lasted a split second, however. Then there was no more time to think. Amarin lunged forward, calling upon his aspect and bringing down an avalanche of destructive force upon the formation of the Song infiltrators. 2 waves of crushing power rolled forward from his weapons, only to shatter against the invisible bulwark of a sonic boom. The concrete floor was shattered as the whole factory trembled. A moment later, a swift silhouette shot toward him from the cloud of dust, Morrow, her calm eyes full of cold, murderous intent. Her shabby civilian clothes were torn, revealing glimpses of a slender enchanted armor hidden beneath. In her hand, there was a narrow blade that seemed too fragile to be used in actual combat. Amarin raised his sword, batting the blade away. At the same time, his hammer flew forward, the spike protruding from its top aimed precisely at the enemy's unprotected throat. However, as soon as his sword met the steel of Morrow's weapon, there was a melodious ring. That ring suddenly magnified, crashing into him like a stone wall. Grimacing from pain piercing his ears, the Knight of Valor was thrown back. He rolled over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of his warriors. They were advancing, ready to clash with the Awakened of Clan Song. Even though Amarin only saw them for a tiny sliver of a second, he noticed two things. First, the blood spilling from the breach in the roof of the main production hall. Second, the fact that only 4 of the 6 cohorts seemed to have made it down. Wrath ignited in his heart. Treacherous worms. One of Morrow's cohorts was missing, and now 2 of his own had failed to descend. It was not hard to understand what had most likely happened. The damned witch must have sent some of her people to ambush the warriors of valor on the upper levels of the factory, to sacrifice their lives so that the rest could escape. A cunning maneuver, albeit a fruitless one. It was of no use. Even with the missing cohort buying the infiltrators time with their blood, the force of Song was still hopelessly outmatched. Morrow was desperate, and wouldn't she be? The executioner she faced was none other than Amarin. The sword of valor was inescapable. These thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. Landing on his feet, Amarin calmly looked up and saw the slender blade falling on his head. His helmet was probably strong enough to withstand the sharp edge, but it was forged out of the best of Valor's steel. Should the strike land, there would be a ringing, and that ringing would be turned into another sonic explosion by the enemy. Instead of the helmet, the blade struck a shield of invisible force that appeared in the air above Amarin. He also wrapped both his weapons with thin layers of force. He was a fast learner, after all. After that first strike, Morrow would find it hard to turn the sound of clashing blades against him. As the 2 masters collided with each other in a lethal battle, so did their soldiers. The Awakened of Valor descended on the formation of the infiltrators like a steel tide, threatening to overwhelm it in an instant. Unfortunately for them, the Awakened of Song were not so easily overwhelmed. Damn it! Morrow saw one of her soldiers fall to the ground in a fountain of blood. His armor was shattered, and the wretched warrior of valor who had killed him was already moving to attack another. But then the servant of the King of Swords fell too, his back tore open. She felt wicked joy. It was strange, though, Morrow missed which of her people had avenged their brother. It must have been a ranged attack, since no one was close enough to deliver a melee strike. There, at the edge of the formation, there was only emptiness and darkness. A good shot, then. Morrow hummed, and her humming was picked up by the rest of the song's messengers. Bright smiles bloomed on their faces. The humming was not an expression of some awakened power or a harbinger of a devastating sonic attack. It was simply their song. A song of slaughter. This brute has a tough shell. She was entangled in a fierce fight with Knight Amarin, preventing him from devastating the formation. Of course, the dog was also preventing her from massacring the attacking Awakened for now. Amarin was powerful, skilled, and intelligent, but he was also arrogant and rigid. Morrow had already landed half a dozen blows on his armor. The problem was that the armor was too tough. It had to be a transcendent memory created by the best forgemasters of Clan Valor, since even her blade, bestowed by the Queen herself, was powerless against its enchanted steel. Even more frustratingly, the knight was using his aspect to wrap himself in a thin layer of protective force, stifling all sounds that could have resulted from their clash. Still, it was just a matter of time before he made a mistake. Morrow was confident. Just a dozen seconds later, however, her confidence waned. Not because she felt pressured by Amarin, and she did, of course. A knight of valor was not an enemy to be taken lightly. No, it was because Morrow was suddenly unsure of how much time she had left. Because their soldiers were dying too quickly. All of them were the absolute elites of the awakened world, so their battle was unsurprisingly intense and bloody. The whole factory was quaking and convulsing from the magnitude of the unleashed violence, as if on the verge of collapsing. Before it did, they would have to escape to the streets. And yet, the battle was somehow too bloody and too lethal. There were too many corpses on the ground already, especially at the edges of the formation, where the fighting was supposed to be less intense. Morrow remembered that the assassin Amarin had sent ahead of the main force was still here, somewhere, in the production hall. That could have been an explanation, if not for the fact that there were more of Valor warriors dying than that of Song. Something strange was going on. Morrow deflected a glancing blow from Amarin's sword and evaded the beak of the war hammer, pushing forward to deliver a strike of her own. I am missing something is not right. Even though she was suppressing the valiant knight, and even though her soldiers were seemingly prevailing against the servants of valor. A cold, unsettling feeling slowly found its way into Morrow's heart. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.